The November wind, sharp and unforgiving, howled down the canyons of Wall Street, rattling the plate-glass windows of Aurelia. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of truffle oil and old money. Arthur Sterling, a man whose net worth fluctuated with the tides of the global market, felt none of the restaurant's warmth. He sat opposite his son, Leo, in a plush velvet booth, the silence between them a chasm wider than the Hudson River. 6 years. 6 years since Leo had uttered a single word. The boy, small for his age with Arthur's dark hair and his mother's haunted, sapphire-blue eyes, was meticulously arranging sugar packets into a perfect, spiraling galaxy on the starched white tablecloth. His focus was absolute, a shield against a world that had proven too loud, too demanding. "Mr. Sterling, your usual table is ready." The maître d', a man named Julian, with a smile as polished as his shoes, gestured toward a more secluded alcove. Arthur's jaw was a knot of granite. "This is fine." He didn't want seclusion. He didn't know what he wanted anymore. He'd built an empire from nothing, a titan of private equity who could bend markets to his will with a single phone call. He could solve any problem, analyze any data set, mitigate any risk. Except this one. Except the beautiful, silent enigma that was his own child. They'd seen everyone. Neurologists at Columbia Presbyterian, child psychiatrists from Stanford, holistic gurus in California who spoke of auras and energy fields. They'd mapped his brain, tested his hearing, analyzed his DNA. The diagnosis was always the same, a clinical, sterile label that explained nothing. Profound, selective mutism, triggered by an unspecified early trauma. The trauma, Arthur knew, was the day his wife, Isabel, had packed her bags, declaring she could not be tethered to a broken child and a man who loved his work more than his family. Leo had been too. He hadn't spoken since. "I'll send your server over, sir." Julian retreated, sensing the Arctic chill emanating from the table. Arthur watched Leo's small fingers, the delicate precision of his movements. The boy wasn't unintelligent. His intelligence was simply turned inward. A light shone on a vast, interior landscape no one else could access. "It's okay, champ," Arthur murmured, the words feeling hollow and useless. "We'll just have a nice dinner." Footsteps approached, so quiet they were almost imperceptible against the restaurant's expensive Persian rugs. Arthur looked up, ready to give his standard, brusque order, and paused. The waitress was new. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with hair the color of autumn leaves tied back in a loose, practical braid. Her eyes were a startling, clear green, like moss after a spring rain. She wore the standard black uniform, but there was nothing standard about her. A tiny, exquisitely carved wooden feather was pinned to her apron, a detail so out of place in this temple of urban sophistication that it was jarring. But it was her stillness that truly arrested him. She didn't fidget or project the forced cheerfulness of most service staff. She simply stood, observant and calm, a small island of peace in the bustling room. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling." Her voice was low and melodic, like the sound of wind through pines. "My name is Clara. I'll be your server tonight." Arthur grunted, his gaze shifting back to his son. "He'll have the grilled chicken, plain, no sauce, steamed carrots. I'll have the New York strip, medium rare, and a bottle of the 82 Petrus." Of course. But Clara didn't move. Arthur could feel her gaze, not on him, but on Leo. He braced himself for the inevitable question, the look of pity, the unsolicited advice. He looked up sharply, ready to cut her down. But the expression on her face was not pity. It was a deep, focused curiosity, a look of profound recognition, as if she were reading a language only she understood. Her eyes weren't on Leo's face, but on his hands, on the swirling galaxy of sugar packets. "Is there a problem?" Arthur's voice was laced with ice. He had zero tolerance for gawkers. A faint blush touched Clara's cheeks, but her gaze didn't waver. "No, sir. I apologize. It's just, he's creating a Fibonacci sequence. The spiral. It's mathematically perfect." Arthur froze. He looked from her face to the sugar packets. She was right. He'd seen it 100 times and just assumed it was a random pattern, a tick. He, the master of algorithms and data patterns, had missed it. This waitress in 10 seconds had seen more than he had in 6 years. "He's very gifted," she added softly, her eyes finally lifting to meet Arthur's. The statement was so simple, so devoid of the clinical jargon he was used to, that it disarmed him. Not "he has a condition" or "he exhibits symptoms," but "he's very gifted." "What's your name?" she asked, her voice directed not at Arthur, but toward the small boy. She didn't lean in, didn't raise her voice. She simply asked the question into the space between them. Leo's hands stilled. For a fraction of a second, his relentless focus on the sugar packets broke. His head tilted, a barely perceptible motion toward the sound of her voice. It wasn't eye contact, it wasn't a response, but it was a reaction, a crack in the fortress of silence. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. "His name is Leo," he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "And before you suggest a new therapist or a special diet, we've tried it all, every single thing." The desperation he usually kept locked down tight was leaking out, raw and ragged. Clara didn't flinch from his anger. Her green eyes held a deep, sorrowful understanding. "I wasn't going to suggest anything, Mr. Sterling. I was just going to say that Leo is a strong name. It means lion. The heart of a lion." Something inside Arthur's chest constricted. He'd chosen the name for that very reason, hoping his son would embody its strength. Before he could process, Clara did something that defied all the rules the therapists had given them. She unpinned the small wooden feather from her apron. It was smooth, dark wood, intricately carved. She didn't offer it to Leo. Instead, she placed it on the edge of the table, several feet from his hands, and gave it a gentle tap. It spun silently on the white linen, a point of quiet motion in the still air. Leo's eyes, those deep blue pools of silence, slowly tracked the spinning feather. His hands, which had been frozen, unclenched. A tiny finger, then another, twitched in its direction. He didn't reach for it, but his entire being seemed to lean toward the small, simple object. The sugar packets were forgotten. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken possibility. The feather wobbled and came to a rest. Leo's gaze remained fixed on it. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if she'd received an answer to a question only she had asked. "I'll get your order started," she said, her voice a murmur. As she turned to leave, Arthur's own voice, a raw, desperate thing, broke the spell. "Wait!" She paused, turning back, her expression patient. Arthur's mind, the one that processed billion-dollar deals in nanoseconds, was spinning as fast as the wooden feather. This was an anomaly, an unexpected data point that defied all previous models. Specialists with decades of experience had failed to elicit this level of engagement. This waitress had done it in under 2 minutes with a 25-cent piece of carved wood. He didn't believe in miracles, he believed in leverage. And this woman, for some reason he couldn't comprehend, had it. "You," he said, leaning forward, his voice low and intense. "What did you just do?" "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." "Don't play coy with me," he snapped, My son has not willingly engaged with a new object or a stranger in 3 years. You broke through. How?" Clara's hands smoothed her apron, the only sign of nervousness she'd shown. "I didn't do anything, Mr. Sterling. I just offered him something quiet. The world is very loud for people who listen with their whole bodies." The words hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. He thought of Leo's life, the blaring television, the traffic of Manhattan, the cacophony of specialists all demanding, probing, testing. When was the last time anyone had offered his son a moment of simple, quiet peace? A reckless, insane idea began to form in his mind, born of pure, unadulterated desperation. He was a man who bought what he wanted. He bought companies. He bought influence. He bought solutions. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his private equity instincts taking over. "Forget being a waitress. Work for me." Clara's eyebrows rose slightly. "Doing what?" "This," he said, gesturing to the space between her and Leo, the space where something impossible had just happened. "Spend time with him. Do whatever it is you just did. I don't care how. Just get him to connect." He took a breath, the words tasting like madness and hope on his tongue. "Get my son to say one word. Just one, and I'll give you my annual salary." The air crackled. Julian, the maitre d', who had been hovering nearby, froze mid-step. A couple at the next table fell silent. Clara's eyes widened. "Mr. Sterling, I'm not qualified. I'm a waitress." "I don't care if you're a professional Martian," Arthur cut her off, his voice resonating with the absolute certainty he used to close deals. He named the figure, a number so staggering it seemed to suck the air out of the room. 1 year. Make my son speak." The restaurant, with its clinking glasses and hushed conversations, seemed to fade away. It was just the three of them in the booth, suspended in this insane, high-stakes offer. Leo, oblivious, had finally, tentatively, reached out a single finger and was now tracing the edge of the carved feather. Clara stared at Arthur, her green eyes searching his face, not with greed, but with something else. An analytical coolness that took him by surprise. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why not another specialist?" "Because," Arthur said, his voice dropping, the raw truth of it exposed. "You're the first person in 6 years who hasn't looked at my son and seen a problem that needs to be fixed. You saw a person." Her gaze drifted to Leo, and her expression softened with a warmth that was breathtaking. When she looked back at Arthur, the gentle waitress was gone, replaced by someone with a core of unshakable steel. "I'm not interested in your money, Mr. Sterling." Arthur blinked. He lived in a world where money was the universal language, the ultimate motivator. The rejection was more stunning than the offer itself. Everyone is interested in money. "Then you've been talking to the wrong people," she said, her chin lifting slightly. "If I agree to this, and that is a very big if, it won't be a transaction. It won't be for a salary. It will be because Leo deserves a chance to be heard, in whatever language he chooses to speak." For the second time that night, Arthur Sterling was rendered completely speechless. This young woman, who likely lived paycheck to paycheck, had just turned down a life-altering sum of money, and, in the process, had schooled him on the nature of his own son's needs. He should have been furious, insulted. Instead, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years bloomed in his chest, a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. "Then what do you want?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Conditions?" she said firmly. "My way. No doctors watching through two-way mirrors. No daily progress reports and data analysis. Just time and trust. You have to trust me, even when my methods make no sense to you. And if I agree? "If you agree," she said, her eyes holding his, "then I will try to help your son find his voice. But I can't promise you it will be the one you're expecting to hear." Before Arthur could answer, Leo's small hand closed around the wooden feather. He didn't lift it. He simply held it, his fingers wrapped around the smooth, carved wood. A quiet act of possession, of acceptance. Arthur looked from his son's hand to Clara's face. He was a man who calculated every risk, but in this moment he was willing to throw all caution to the wind. He was betting the most precious thing in his life on a mysterious waitress with moss-green eyes and a core of steel. "Deal," he said. 3 days later, Arthur found himself standing in a place he hadn't visited since he was a boy, the entrance to the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. He wore a bespoke Zegna suit that felt laughably out of place. Leo stood beside him, his small hand lost in Arthur's, his eyes wide as he took in the sheer scale of the trees. Clara had been precise. The Taine family forest, 10 a.m., wear comfortable shoes, and leave your phone in the car. The last directive had felt like being asked to sever a limb, but he'd agreed to her terms, trust. At exactly 10 a.m., she appeared on the path. She was dressed in worn jeans, hiking boots, and a simple green fleece jacket. Her braided hair was tucked into a wool hat. She looked more at home here than she ever had in the sterile elegance of Aurelia. She carried a small, weathered canvas backpack. "Good morning, Leo," she said, her voice carrying easily on the quiet air. She smiled at the boy, then turned her calm, green eyes on Arthur. "You can go now." Arthur stiffened. "Excuse me? I'm not leaving my son alone with you." "Then this won't work," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "He can't be himself if he's being watched. He knows you're waiting for a result, for a word. That pressure is a wall. I need you to give him space. Trust him. Trust me." She pointed to a small cafe near the conservatory. "You can wait there. I'll bring him back in 2 hours." Every protective instinct in Arthur's body screamed in protest. He'd spent a small fortune on a private investigator in the last 2 days, only to have the man come back with almost nothing. Clara Hale grew up in a remote part of upstate New York, no college degree on record, worked a series of odd jobs, no social media, no credit card debt, no digital footprint to speak of. She was a ghost, and he was about to entrust his son to her. He looked down at Leo. The boy wasn't looking at him, but at Clara. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet curiosity. He remembered their agreement, her way. 2 hours, he said, his voice tight. He knelt down. "I'll be right over there, champ. You be good." He expected Leo to cling to him, to show some sign of distress. Instead, the boy simply squeezed his hand once, then let go, his attention already back on Clara. Arthur walked away, each step feeling like a betrayal of his fatherly duties. He found a seat at the cafe, ordered a coffee he didn't touch, and watched. Clara didn't lead Leo by the hand. She simply started walking down a path into the old-growth forest, and after a moment's hesitation, Leo followed. She didn't speak to him. She didn't point things out. She just walked, her pace slow and deliberate. Arthur watched them disappear among the ancient trees. The next 2 hours were the longest of his life. He paced. He checked his watch 12 times. He fought the urge to march in there and retrieve his son. What was she doing? What was this bizarre, silent therapy? Finally, he saw them emerge from the woods. Leo's cheeks were pink from the cold, and there was a smudge of dirt on his nose. He was holding something in his hand, a smooth, grey stone. As they approached, Arthur saw Clara kneel in front of Leo. She didn't say anything. She simply held out her hand. Leo looked down at the stone he held, then at her open palm. He hesitated, then gently placed the stone in her hand. Clara closed her fingers around it, brought the fist to her heart for a moment, and then gave him a slow, deliberate nod. Leo nodded back. It was a conversation, a complete, silent conversation. Arthur felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. He had been trying to teach his son to speak his language, the language of words and sounds. Clara was learning to speak Leo's. When they reached the cafe, Clara smiled. "He did wonderfully." "What did you do?" Arthur demanded, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and frustration. "We walked," she said simply. "We listened to the squirrels. We felt the moss on the trees. And we traded stories." "Stories?" Arthur looked at his silent son. "How?" Clara held up the grey stone. This was his story. It was about something solid and quiet and patient. She reached into her own pocket and pulled out the small, carved wooden feather. "This was my story. It was about something light that wanted to fly, but was tied to the ground." She looked at Arthur, her green eyes piercing. "You don't need a voice to tell a story, Mr. Sterling. You just need someone who is willing to listen." Over the next few weeks, this became their routine. Twice a week they would meet at a park, a nature preserve, a quiet stretch of beach along the Sound. Clara never pushed. She never asked Leo to speak. She introduced him to the world through texture, scent, and silence. She taught him to identify birds by their flight patterns, to distinguish trees by the feel of their bark. She communicated with him through a shared language of found objects. A fallen leaf meant sadness, a piece of sea glass meant hope, a pine cone meant home. Arthur watched from a distance, his skepticism slowly, painstakingly eroding. He saw his son, who had always been a tense, coiled spring of anxiety, begin to relax. He saw him smile, a genuine, unguarded smile, when a chipmunk ate a nut from his outstretched hand. One afternoon, Arthur arrived early to find Clara sitting alone on their usual bench, sketching in a small notebook. He sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance. "He's changing," Arthur said quietly. "I don't understand what you're doing, but it's working." Clara didn't look up from her drawing. "I'm not doing anything. I'm just giving him a space where he doesn't have to be anything other than what he is. The world demands performance. Silence is not a performance." She paused her sketching and finally looked at him. "What I don't understand is you. You're a man who controls everything. Why are you letting me do this? Why do you trust me?" It was a question Arthur had been asking himself. "I don't," he admitted, the honesty surprising them both. "But I trust what I see. And I see my son calming down. I see him engaging with the world for the first time in his life." He hesitated. "My investigator found almost nothing about you. You're a blank slate." "Who are you, Clara Hale?" Her smile was sad. She closed the sketchbook and tucked it into her bag. "I used to be someone else," she said, her voice distant. "Someone who had a little brother. His name was Daniel." Arthur waited, sensing they were approaching the heart of the matter. "Daniel was like Leo," she continued, her gaze fixed on the distant trees. "He didn't speak. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. He spoke in other ways. He spoke with the way he'd arrange stones, the way he'd watch the clouds. I was the only one who understood him. We had our own language, just like this." She gestured to the park around them. "What happened to him?" Arthur asked gently. The light in her eyes dimmed. "When I was 16 and he was 7, we were out in the woods behind our house. I got distracted by a book. just for a minute. When I looked up, he was gone. He'd wandered off. Her voice cracked. They searched for days. They never found him. The official story is that he fell into the river. But I know the truth. She turned to face him, and the pain in her eyes was so raw it was like a physical wound. He was trying to tell me something that morning. He kept bringing me white quartz pebbles, which was his sign for fear. He was scared of something in the woods, but I wasn't listening properly. I was a teenager, lost in my own world. My failure to listen cost him his life. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and tragic. Arthur finally understood. Her gift wasn't a technique, it was a penance. Her reluctance wasn't modesty, it was terror. "So you ran," he said softly. "You stopped speaking the language because you were afraid you'd misinterpret it again." "I couldn't bear it," she whispered, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "I came here, took a different name for a while, became someone simple, a waitress, no one to be responsible for, no one to fail. Until you met Leo," Arthur finished for her. "Until I met Leo," she agreed, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "And I saw my brother in his eyes. And I couldn't walk away, even though I'm terrified every single day that I'm going to fail him, too." In that moment, Arthur's last vestiges of skepticism dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching respect. He wasn't dealing with a charlatan or an opportunist. He was dealing with a wounded healer, a woman whose extraordinary gift was born from an unbearable loss. He felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to comfort her. But he knew that physical touch was not the language she trusted. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He stood up, walked to a nearby oak tree, and picked up a perfectly formed acorn. He walked back and, mirroring the gesture he'd seen her use with Leo, he placed the acorn gently in her open palm. He didn't know what it meant, but he hoped she would. She looked down at the acorn, then up at him, and for the first time, her sad smile reached her eyes. In their silent language he knew, an acorn meant a new beginning. The invitation arrived on a thick, cream-colored card, the Sterling family crest embossed in gold at the top. Eleanor Sterling, Arthur's mother and the unyielding matriarch of a dynasty built on old-world banking, requested his presence at the annual Sterling Foundation Gala. The note at the bottom, in her sharp, elegant script, was not a request, but a command. "Arthur, it is time for Leo to be seen by our supporters. And do try to bring a suitable partner. The optics are important." Arthur crumpled the invitation in his fist. His mother viewed Leo's silence as a family embarrassment, a flaw in the Sterling legacy that needed to be managed, or better yet, hidden. The idea of parading his sensitive son through a ballroom of prying eyes and whispered judgments made his blood run cold. He was about to call and refuse when an idea, both terrifying and brilliant, took hold. He wouldn't hide Leo. He would arm him. He would bring him with his translator, his shield, his friend. He found Clara at the end of her shift, wiping down tables at Aurelia. The restaurant had kept her job open for her, a fact Arthur had ensured with a quiet, 5-figure donation to their staff holiday fund. "I need a favor," he said, getting straight to the point. She looked up, her expression wary. "Your favors tend to involve life-altering propositions. This one involves a black tie gala, a room full of sharks, and my mother." Clara's rag stilled. "Absolutely not. She's demanding I bring Leo," he pressed. "You know what that environment will do to him. The noise, the people staring. He'll shut down completely. But if you're there, you're his safe harbor. You can help him navigate it. You can speak his language when he can't." He saw the conflict in her eyes, her desire to protect Leo warring with her deep-seated fear of judgment and failure. "One night," he said softly. "For Leo." She let out a long, slow breath. "Fine, for Leo. But I don't own anything that would pass for the black tie." "I'll take care of it," he said, relief washing over him. 2 nights later, when the elevator doors opened to his penthouse, Arthur felt his breath catch in his throat. A stylist he'd hired had worked with Clara, and the result was staggering. She wore a simple, floor-length gown of deep forest green silk that shimmered under the lights. It matched her eyes perfectly. Her auburn hair was swept up in an elegant twist, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She wore no jewelry, save for a pair of small, silver leaf earrings. She was a woodland nymph in a world of concrete and steel, and she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Don't," she said, her cheeks flushing as she read the look on his face. "It's just a dress." "It's not just a dress," he said, his voice husky. Leo, dressed in a miniature tuxedo, ran out from the living room. He didn't make a sound, but his face lit up with pure joy when he saw her. He ran to her, not hugging her, but gently taking her hand and placing it on his own chest, right over his heart. It was his sign for happiness. Clara knelt, her expensive dress pooling on the marble floor without a second thought. She smiled at him and tapped her own heart in response. The ballroom at the Pierre was a glittering spectacle of excess. Diamonds flashed, champagne flowed, and the air buzzed with the self-important chatter of New York's elite. As they entered, a hush fell over the room. All eyes were on them. The reclusive billionaire, his silent son, and the stunning, unknown woman at his side. Eleanor Sterling descended upon them like a bird of prey, clad in icy blue Chanel and dripping with ancestral diamonds. Her smile was a thin, blood-red slash. "Arthur, you came." Her eyes swept over Clara with a dismissive chill. "And you brought a friend." "Mother, this is Clara Hale. Clara, my mother, Eleanor Sterling." "A pleasure, Mrs. Sterling," Clara said, her voice calm and steady, betraying none of the nervousness she must have felt. "Hale?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "I don't know that name. Are you one of the Massachusetts Hales?" "No, Mum," Clara said politely. "I'm one of the upstate New York Hales. We're known more for our maple syrup than our trust funds." A few people nearby tittered. Eleanor's smile tightened. Her gaze fell to Leo, who was clinging to Clara's hand, his eyes wide with anxiety from the overwhelming sensory input. "And you've been—" "What, exactly? Tutoring the boy?" Eleanor's tone made the word tutoring sound like an accusation. "Clara is Leo's friend," Arthur cut in, his voice sharp. "She's teaching him to communicate." "Communicate?" Eleanor laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Darling, the boy is mute. What he needs is a team of doctors, not a nature guide." She turned her full, formidable attention to Clara. "Tell me, Miss Hale, where did you receive your doctorate? What is your specialty?" This was it. The moment of confrontation. The clash between old money and new methods. Between rigid expectation and quiet understanding. Clara met the older woman's gaze without flinching. "I don't have a doctorate, Mrs. Sterling. My specialty is listening." Eleanor looked as though Clara had slapped her. "I see. So you have no qualifications whatsoever. You're just another in a long line of opportunists preying on my son's desperation." Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper, meant only for them to hear. "You saw a billionaire with a damaged child and saw your meal ticket. You should be ashamed." Arthur stepped forward, fury coiling in his gut. "That's enough, Mother." But before he could say more, Clara put a restraining hand on his arm. She looked at Eleanor, not with anger, but with a profound, almost pitying sadness. "You're wrong, Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden lull. "I'm not here for your son's money. I'm here for your grandson's heart. Something you seem to have forgotten exists." The audacity of the statement shocked the onlookers into silence. Eleanor's face went pale with rage. "How dare you?" she hissed. "You are nothing, a nobody." "She's not a nobody." The voice was small, raspy from disuse, but it cut through the tension in the ballroom like a thunderclap. Everyone froze. Arthur's heart stopped beating. He turned slowly, almost afraid of what he would see. Leo stood with his feet planted, his hand still holding Clara's. His face was pale, his knuckles were white, but his blue eyes were blazing with a lion's fire. He looked directly at his grandmother. "She's my friend," he said, each word a monumental effort, a stone pulled from the bottom of a deep, silent well. The world tilted on its axis. A collective gasp went through the room. Eleanor stared at her grandson, her mouth agape, her carefully constructed composure shattered. Leo wasn't finished. He let go of Clara's hand, took a shaky step forward, and looked at the sea of stunned faces. He held up his small hands. He touched his heart, then pointed at Clara. Happiness. Her. Then he pointed at the crowd, at the glittering chandeliers, at the whole overwhelming scene, and slowly, deliberately, shook his head. No. It was a complete sentence, delivered in 2 languages. He had found his voice, and he had used it not to ask for something, but to defend someone. He had used it to speak his truth. Tears were streaming down Arthur's face, hot and unchecked. He didn't care who saw. He knelt in front of his son, his whole body shaking with the force of his emotions. "You spoke," he whispered, his voice thick. "Oh, Leo. You spoke." Leo looked at him, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. He reached out and touched his father's wet cheek. Then he looked back at Clara, who was crying as silently as he had lived for 6 years. "Clara," he said, the name a perfect, 2-syllable miracle. In the silent, stunned ballroom, Arthur Sterling looked from his son, his brilliant, brave son, to the woman who had performed this miracle. She hadn't fixed him. She had given him the safety and the language to fix himself. And in that moment, Arthur knew, with a certainty that shook him to his soul, that his insane, desperate proposition at the restaurant hadn't just been about saving Hesse. The silence that followed the gala was not the empty, aching void that had once defined the Sterling penthouse. It was a new kind of quiet, a space filled with the gravity of unspoken things, vibrating with the echo of 3 small words. Leo's voice, once unleashed, did not become a torrent. It was a shy spring bubbling up through long frozen earth, emerging one precious drop at a time. A word for the color of the sky. "Blue," whispered as he stared out the window. A name for the moon. Luna. A word Clara had taught him from an old book of myths. Each utterance was a miracle, a delicate jewel they received with held breath, careful not to startle the source with too much excitement. Arthur found himself living in this new quiet, a world recalibrated around these small sounds. He, a man who had commanded boardrooms with thunderous authority, now measured his days by the volume of a child's whisper. He learned to move with a gentler tread, to speak in a lower register. He discovered that the most profound conversations he'd ever had were the ones that unfolded without a single spoken word, in the shared glance between him and Clara, when Leo pointed to a sleeping pigeon on the ledge and made a soft, shushing sound. His entire empire, the towering edifice of his life's work, began to feel like a noisy, irrelevant distraction from the real business being conducted in the heart of his own home. His relationship with Clara deepened in that same tender quiet. It was a love that grew in the spaces between words. It was in the way she'd place a mug of tea on his desk without interrupting his thoughts, the way he'd find a warm blanket draped over her when she fell asleep reading on the sofa. It was a choreography of care, a dance of two souls who had learned to listen to the rhythm of the other. The night he finally kissed her, weeks after the gala, was on the balcony overlooking the sleeping park. The city lights blurred into a soft bokeh behind her, and the only sound was the distant sigh of traffic. He hadn't planned it. He had simply looked at her as she pointed out a constellation, her face illuminated by the city glow, and the distance between them became an unbearable fiction. He cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, and she leaned into his touch with a sigh of her own, a sound of surrender and homecoming. The kiss was not a conquest but a question, which her lips answered with a gentle, unequivocal yes. It was a fragile paradise, and they both knew it. The world, especially the world Eleanor Sterling inhabited, does not suffer such idols to exist for long. The blow came not as a thunderclap, but as the cold, sterile rustle of expensive paper. A courier delivered a thick legal envelope. Inside, a petition for guardianship of Leo, filed in the family court of the state of New York. The language was brutal, clinical, and cruel. It painted Arthur as a man unmoored by grief, fallen under the sway of a charismatic but dangerously unqualified individual. That individual was Clara. The petition detailed her past with surgical precision, twisting the tragedy of her brother, Daniel, from a source of empathy into a damning indictment of negligence. It cited her lack of formal credentials, her transient work history, her unorthodox methods. It concluded that Leo was in the care of an unstable guardian and a manipulative charlatan, and that his best interests, a phrase that made Arthur's blood run cold, would be served by placing him in the custody of his grandmother. Arthur read the document twice, a cold, silent fury building in his chest until he felt it might shatter his ribs. This was his mother's true power. Not her social standing, but her willingness to weaponize pain, to turn a person's deepest wound into a legal strategy. He found Clara in Leo's room, sitting on the floor beside the boy. They were building a tower of smooth grey stones, the same kind they had first collected in the forest. When she saw the look on his face, the papers in his hand, a shadow passed over her features. He didn't need to say a word. She knew. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The stone in her hand trembled. "She's using him," Arthur said, his voice a low growl. "She's using your brother to take my son." Clara's face went pale. The carefully constructed peace she had built for herself over the years, the fragile truce she had made with her ghosts, shattered. He saw it in her eyes, the old terror returning, the paralyzing guilt. She wasn't just afraid of a court battle. She was afraid the world, and by extension, he, would finally see her as Eleanor did, as a failure, as the girl who had let her brother vanish into the woods. "Maybe she's right," Clara whispered, her gaze falling to the floor. "I don't have any degrees. I don't have any qualifications. All I have is this feeling, this memory. What if I am a danger to him? What if I fail him like I failed?" She couldn't finish the sentence. The tower of stones tumbled to the rug. Arthur crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his. Leo watched them, his blue eyes wide and knowing, a silent observer of the adult storm that had just broken over their world. "Listen to me, Clara Hale," Arthur said, his voice fierce with a conviction that came from the very center of his soul. "Qualifications are pieces of paper that prove you learned something. What you have is a truth that you lived. Don't you dare let her poison that. Don't you dare let her make you doubt the miracle you have brought into this house." He squeezed her hands. "I was the one who failed him. I had all the money, all the power, all the experts. I filled his life with noise and pressure, and I almost broke him. You walked in with a carved feather and a quiet heart, and you gave him back his soul. That is the only qualification that has ever mattered." He looked from her tear-filled eyes to Leo, who had begun to carefully, deliberately rebuild the fallen tower. "We are not going to lose," Arthur said, a vow resonating in the quiet room. "She thinks this is a battle that can be won with money and lawyers. She's wrong. This is a battle that will be won with truth." The hearing was held in a sterile, wood-paneled room that felt a universe away from the whispering forests and open skies where Leo had found his peace. Eleanor sat at the opposing table, a marble statue of matriarchal certainty, flanked by a team of lawyers who radiated expensive, predatory competence. Their attack was relentless. They called a parade of child psychologists and behavioral specialists to the stand. These experts, many of whom Arthur had once employed, spoke in a language of clinical detachment about selective mutism, trauma response, and the necessity of structured, evidence-based therapies. They characterized Clara's methods as irresponsible, unscientific, and potentially harmful. They created a portrait of a well-meaning but ignorant amateur, playing with the delicate psyche of a vulnerable child. Then, Eleanor's lead counsel, a shark named Marcus Thorne, called Clara to the stand. Arthur felt his hands clench into fists. Thorne began gently, his voice laced with false sympathy, asking her about her childhood, her education, her life in upstate New York. And then he moved in for the kill. "Miss Hale, let's talk about your brother, Daniel," he said, his tone shifting to one of prosecutorial gravity. "It's true, is it not, that on the day he disappeared, he was under your direct supervision?" "Yes," Clara's voice was a whisper. "And you were, by your own admission to authorities at the time, distracted. Reading a book?" "Yes." "So a 7-year-old boy, a non-verbal boy who could not call for help, vanished from the woods while in your care. A boy who was never seen again." Thorne let the words hang in the air, a cloud of poison. "Miss Hale, some might call that a tragic accident. Others might call it gross negligence. Given that history, why should this court believe you are a suitable companion for another vulnerable, non-verbal child?" The courtroom was silent. Arthur could feel Clara shrinking on the stand, the weight of that old, unbearable grief pressing down on her. He saw the doubt, the fear, the self-recrimination warring in her eyes. He wanted to leap up, to scream, to shield her from this brutal dissection of her soul. But he knew this was a crucible she had to pass through herself. Clara took a deep, shaky breath. She looked not at the lawyer, but at Arthur. He met her gaze and gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. "Trust my way." Her own words coming back to her. When she spoke, her voice was different. It was no longer the whisper of a victim, but the clear, quiet tone of a survivor. "You're right, Mr. Thorne," she said, stunning the lawyer into a momentary silence. "It was my responsibility, and for half of my life, I have carried the weight of that failure. I have replayed that afternoon 1,000,000 times. I have drowned in the guilt of it." She paused, her green eyes scanning the room before settling on the judge, a weary-looking woman named Judge Adrian Campos. "But what I have also done," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength, "is spent 15 years trying to understand what I failed to see that day. I failed to listen. Not with my ears, but with my whole being. My brother was speaking to me all morning, but I didn't know how to hear him. He brought me white quartz pebbles. That was his language for fear. He was telling me he was afraid of something in the woods. But I was a 16-year-old girl who thought language was only made of words." Tears began to trace paths down her cheeks, but her voice did not waver. My qualification is not a degree. My qualification is a scar. It's a fluency in the language of silence that was paid for with the person I loved most in the world. When I met Leo, I didn't see a problem to be fixed. I saw my brother, and I made a silent promise that this time I would listen. I would listen to his patterns, to the objects he chose, to the light in his eyes. I would honor his language, and I would not fail him. She looked directly at Eleanor Sterling, whose face was a mask of cold fury. "You see Leo as a flaw in your legacy. I see him as a teacher. He has taught your son how to be a father, and he has taught me how to forgive myself," she finished, her chest heaving, the raw, breathtaking truth of her testimony echoing in the silent room. Thorne, for the first time, seemed at a loss for words. When it was Arthur's turn to testify, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He was no longer the Titan of Wall Street. He was simply Leo's father. Thorne tried to paint him as a fool, a desperate man duped by a pretty face. "Mr. Sterling, you are one of the sharpest financial minds in the world. You deal in data, in facts, in quantifiable results, and yet you entrusted your son to a woman with no credentials, based on what? A gut feeling? Her story about a wooden feather?" Arthur looked at the judge. "Your Honor, for years I treated my son like a failing asset. I threw money at the problem, I collected data, I demanded results, and in doing so, I nearly lost him entirely. My son wasn't a line item on a balance sheet. He was a human being drowning in a world that was too loud." He turned his gaze on Clara. "Ms. Hale didn't offer me a 5-point plan or a statistical probability of success. She offered him silence. She offered him patience. She offered him the profound respect of meeting him where he was, instead of demanding he come to where we were. She didn't teach him to speak. She created a world so safe that he chose to speak." He leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Thorne is correct. I deal in investments, and I can tell you, with absolute certainty, that trusting Clara Hale has been the single greatest investment of my life. The returns are not quantifiable in any currency the world recognizes, but they are immeasurable. She didn't just give my son back his voice, she gave me back my son. The final act of the drama took place, not in the open court, but in the judge's chambers. Judge Campos, her face unreadable, decided she needed to speak with Leo alone. A child psychologist would be present, but no family. The wait was the most excruciating hour of Arthur's life. He and Clara sat side by side on a hard wooden bench in the hallway, not speaking, their hands locked together so tightly their knuckles were white. What could a 6-year-old boy say or do to sway the course of his own life? The pressure on him was immense, the exact thing they had worked so hard to remove. When the door finally opened, Leo walked out, his face calm. He walked straight to Clara and Arthur and tucked himself between them, leaning his head against Arthur's arm. A moment later, a court officer called them back into the courtroom. Judge Campos looked down at them from the bench. The room was thick with tension. "I have reviewed all the testimony," she began, her voice even. I have read the reports from the experts, and I have listened to the arguments from both sides. This court's only mandate is the well-being of the child, Leo Sterling." She paused, looking from Eleanor to Arthur and Clara. In my chambers, I didn't pressure Leo to speak. I sat with him on the floor, and we looked at a book about birds. For 10 minutes, he didn't say a word. He simply pointed at the pictures. Then he got up, walked to the window, and looked down at the street. He pointed at a yellow taxi and whispered a single word. The judge looked down at her notes. He said, "Loud." "Then," she continued, "he came back to my desk. He took a small grey stone from his pocket, a stone he had apparently been holding this entire time, and he placed it in my hand. He then pointed at the stone, and then pointed at his own chest." She looked up, her gaze meeting Clara's. I believe in the language of his world. He was telling me that this stone represented something solid, something safe, something about himself. "Finally," Judge Campos said, her voice softening. He took the stone back from my hand. He walked over to the door. He didn't knock. He simply put his hand on the doorknob and looked back at me, his expression perfectly clear. He wanted to leave. He wanted to go back to his father and to Miss Hale. His silence, in that moment, was more eloquent than any speech. It spoke of trust. It spoke of a desire to return to his safe harbor. She took a deep breath. This court is not blind to the unconventional nature of Miss Hale's methods, but it is also not blind to their apparent success. The well-being of a child is not an academic theory. It is a living, breathing reality. And the reality is that in the care of his father and Miss Hale, this child has begun to heal. He has begun to find his voice, in whatever form he chooses to use it. She looked directly at Eleanor. The petition for guardianship is denied. A collective exhale swept through Arthur and Clara's side of the room. Arthur pulled Clara into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair, the relief so overwhelming it felt like a physical pain. Leo, caught between them, wrapped his small arms around both their waists. Later that evening, after the lawyers had departed and the adrenaline had faded, Arthur found his mother standing alone by the courthouse steps, her composure, for once, completely gone. She looked older, smaller, defeated. He approached her quietly. "It's over, Mother." She didn't look at him. "You humiliated me. You chose that girl over your own family, over the Sterling name." "She is my family," Arthur said, the words simple and true. "And the Sterling name is just a word. Leo is my son. For the first time, I'm putting him first." He hesitated. "The door is not closed, but if you want to be in his life, you will have to learn a new language. You will have to learn to be quiet. You will have to learn to listen." He left her there, a solitary figure in the twilight, a relic of a world that no longer had any power over him. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, the three of them stood on a plot of land in the Hudson Valley, a sprawling acreage of rolling hills and dense woodland that bordered a state forest. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Arthur had not built a center for Clara. Instead, he had bought the land and created a trust, making her and a board of her choosing its stewards. Today they were not planning or building. They were simply walking. Leo, now 7, moved through the woods with a quiet confidence, his initial anxiety replaced by a deep, comfortable curiosity. He still spoke sparingly, but his silence was different now. It was not a fortress. It was a peaceful kingdom over which he ruled. He ran ahead and came back, holding 2 objects. In one hand, he held a perfect crimson maple leaf. In the other, a jagged piece of dark grey slate. He held them out to Clara. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "A story?" she asked. Leo nodded seriously. He handed her the sharp piece of slate. She took it, understanding. It was the past. Fear. The courtroom. His grandmother. The sharp edges of the world. Then he gently placed the perfect maple leaf on top of the slate in her palm. It covered the jagged rock almost completely, its vibrant color a stark contrast to the dull grey beneath. Arthur watched, his heart full. He understood. Beauty covering pain, peace overcoming fear. "And what about this?" Arthur asked, picking up a fallen acorn from the ground. He held it out. "What story is this?" Leo looked at the acorn, then at Arthur, then at Clara. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. He reached out, his small fingers closing around the acorn in his father's hand. He held it for a moment, then looked up at the towering oak tree from which it had fallen. His voice, when it came, was clear and confident, ringing with a simple, profound truth that echoed through the quiet woods. "Home," he said. "We're building a home.